Okay. All right, so welcome back, everyone. I am delighted to welcome you to this episode number 5 we're on for our Growing Resilience webinar series. And we're delighted to have you here. I am very delighted to introduce a special guest to you in a moment who is going to guide this session. And but I want to just begin by just reminding everybody on the sessions where we're at, what we're talking about. This series, there's of course, the recordings of all our previous episodes are on our website and links will be shared. And here is our calendar. We have arrived in August, and today we're going to talk about regenerative community well-being. After discussing regenerative well-being as a concept, and we have identified the fact that it all starts with us individually, and there are frameworks available that help us kind of really be the change. And looking at what that looks like in the bigger picture, given the challenges that we're facing in our communities. So today I am incredibly delighted to introduce to you Dr. Ebony Green. And I am going to stop my share and just say a few words. Hi. So Dr. Ebony Green is the CEO of Cornerstone Equity Consultants. She's a leader in education and a nationally recognized champion for inclusion. Dr. Green also draws on over 25 years of experience in leading schools, organizations, and people into really deep into themselves to inspire transformation in communities. And you can see some of how she does that in a really lovely way. Of course, I expect today, but also in her wonderful podcast that is called Hello Kind Soul. And I'll plop a link in the chat here as well in a moment, where she helps audiences understand some really complex ideas in a simplified way that support their personal growth and connection to the community around them. Dr. Green also authored a book that is called Acts of Liberation, which I believe came out not so long ago. And this is really where she introduces the unique ideology of tower moments and what they are and how they can help shape our lives and how to resolve and how to heal those moments to achieve our true purpose. So I'll put both of those links in the chat in a moment so that you can connect with Dr. Green. But welcome and thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I hear an echo in talking, but I'm not sure. It might. Okay, it's gone. Wait, it's good. So I appreciate you having me. We're gonna jump in. I'm gonna share my slides deck, if that's okay, and also to wait a minute. Hold on a second. Let's see if this works. Can you see my slides? Okay, perfect. And so I also will share that the way we have this conversation really is going to situate like what is our responsibility to kind of show up and do this work beyond the terminology and the words that we use, right? And so I think part of the challenge is when we think about, you know, what's on offer, what's on ask, is that we get lost in the nuance of language, and we're really good at using the language, and we really struggle to apply that language in a way that actually creates difference in the world. And so I just think it's important to start with this idea of like, what is the importance of communities, right? And I say that because, historically speaking, we speak about community as this huge thing that we all operate within, And we kind of separate ourselves from this idea that there are communities with distinct needs and differences. And so it's impossible for us to think about it as generally as we do, because there's such nuance within certain communities, right? And then even digging down deeper to that is to think about that there are cultural norms in the communities, in addition to the unique needs of each of those people. And so oftentimes when we talk about it, what we do for one community usually cannot and will not be able to be applied to another community, which is why when I was thinking about like, how do we have a conversation around what do we need to really build the community? It's to think about discrete ideas that potentially you then take and create space to apply them wherever you are. And so strong communities contribute to both human and environmental well-being, right? Because when we're thinking about this idea of community, one, it's to say, okay, what are the things that we're doing to make sure the folks within this particular space really thrive? And how does improving the conditions of those folks essentially impact the environmental well-being in their particular world, right? And so when we think about what does it mean to build a community, it's to really pan out to say, do we even have the context of what does it mean for communities to thrive, right? When we think about the notion of thriving, we often will apply it to the ways in which we see it needs to thrive, right? What we believe means they're doing well and flourishing. And oftentimes, even in that thought process, we are detached from really asking the community, what do you need to thrive? What do you see as the integral pieces that we have to support in building, creating, so that the infrastructure, the ecosystem can exist when we're no longer in those communities? And that's why we often will see, folks really turn a corner, whether it's a school or organization or an actual community, do really well. And then when certain things leave those communities, they tend to struggle because we don't always build the infrastructure into that system so that irrespective of who's there supporting people, they're able to be cared for in a way that they're successful on their own, right? And so when I think about the biggest thing for me that I spend a lot of time working with people around and really keying into is this notion of collective care, right? And so when I think of collective care, like the next thing that always pops into my mind is self-care. And the reason those things to me go hand in hand, there are two things that come to mind. One is that hurt people. And so if we're not doing work individually within that community to really make sure that we are as good as we can be, it's virtually impossible to engage and interact in collective care, right? And so collective care in the way that I see it or I talk about it is that I don't actually have to know Susie to care if Susie's good. I just have to know how it feels to feel good in my body, right? And so the goal of the aspirational, if you will, goal is to build in a way that irrespective of whether I know you or not, that you're okay, that your needs are being met, that you are healthy physically, emotionally, spiritually, and that you have the things you need, right? And I think that is what anchors the core piece around community, right? Because while I want to say for example, I live in Newburgh, the greater Newburgh community matters to me. I don't live in New York City, but certainly what happens there is connected to me and my well-being. And so I would like to believe that the more we're able to really think about this notion of like resilience and care and community building and bridge building and all of those things, we are all anchored in the fundamental belief system that whether I know you or not, your wellness really matters, right? And so the piece that really is our work is how do we get other people in communities who are struggling to be able to step outside their immediate struggle to understand that their struggle is a part of the bigger struggle. And so is it the reverse engineering to say, okay, all of us are struggling in some way, shape, or form. Now let's figure out how we're able to kind of backward maps to solve the needs of individuals so that the collective is good. Like that's the work in front of us. That's always been the work in front of us. But we tend to think, particularly in this country, but I'm sure other countries, we're very individualistic in the way that we think about the world. And so it's like, well, my community needs more than that community. But the truth of the matter is, until all, what is it? We're not free until everyone's free, right? Like, until all of us are collectively well, there's this looming piece that says there are people who need support, and I have to figure out how to support them, right? And so the undertone of that is always empathy and compassion, and they're very different, right? So empathy is that I can understand and think about what you're going through and resonate how problematic that is, how struggling feels or looks like. I can think about how it might feel, your circumstance. But the piece, that the goal of what we're trying to do is walk people to the notion of compassion, that I not only can understand what you're experiencing, but more importantly, I want to alleviate your pain, right? And I think, you know, recently I had some circumstances in my life that really required me to think about what does it mean to really be compassionate. And what I've come away with was the awareness that while what I had to do caused me a great deal of pain, I had to alleviate the pain of someone else, something else, right? And there's no greater level of compassion than being able to do something in service of something, someone else, the mission, the vision that doesn't really benefit you necessarily, right? But it's the very essence of collective care. And so, you know, the community and its role in individual and collective well-being, to me, are all interconnected, right? And so, as I said before, this notion of like, okay, I want Olivia to be good, because if Olivia is good, she can go into the world and continue to create great change. And generally, we all realize that if I'm not good, I can't go do as much of the good that I want to do here. And so it behooves me that in my community, that I'm able to not only seek support, but lend support. And that while we think about oftentimes supporting communities, we think about it from the realm of like resources outside of ourselves, right? That the help we need has to come, as opposed to the help we need, we have to harness within our community. There's a disconnect because you're waiting for people to show up that may or may not come. And what we all know generally is most times it doesn't come, or it comes and it's not necessarily in the support that you need. And so we essentially put Band-Aids on wounds that don't heal, because the goal isn't to really figure out what is the root of the problem and what do we have to do deeply to change the current circumstance, right? When we think about this notion of implementation science, for example, part of the work is that oftentimes people are moving so fast that they overshoot what the problem is. All they're thinking about is they move straight to solution, but they never examine the problem deeply enough to really understand what are the mechanisms in play that are actually substantiating and continuing to feed the problem so it continues to get bigger. And so part of us, our work as folks in the community, supporting communities, is to slow that process down. And yes, we can recognize that we might be on level 7 of an emergency. But we certainly also then have to move with intention to say, I have to deeply understand the problem and reserve the urgency to create a solution that doesn't solve because it's not the actual problem we're solving for. And that's where many folks in communities miss it, because yes, there are absolutely systemic pieces that all of us could probably sit and chop it up around about, well, what are the issues in the community? And then there are different communities. When we start to really drill down to individual communities, we will see that the problem is not what we thought the problem is. So I'm going to give you an example to really drive this home. When I worked in a school system, part of the issue were young people, and it's the context of school because that's where I spent the bulk of my time in my career, but this will certainly be applicable to all communities. So in this particular school I worked at, this district, the issue were kids coming late to school all the time, or not coming until, second, third period. And so the initial problem discussed was they don't want to get up, they don't take school seriously. They're too late to come into the building, right? There was all this rhetoric and conversation about the children that just don't care. And we all know that's talking points often about communities that are in need. And so as we did work in the role that I had, I was like, I want to say that kids don't care, but that's not the evidence I have in front of me. I was a principal, I've been around a long time, and the average young person does care. Let's keep looking at the problem. So to expedite the story, long story short, the more we started to talk and deconstruct the problem, the issue is, one of the issues was that, one, children had to go through security. So even if a child showed up at 7 o'clock on time, they're on a long line waiting to go to security to get scanned, which then makes them late automatically to class. So that's your first piece that people missed if we don't realize the actual experience of a young person going in that school. And the bigger problem is that we were asking young people to walk through one of the most dangerous communities to get to school, and we didn't provide busing. So if you lived within a mile radius, there was no busing to get you there. And the expectation was, in the middle of the dark, in the winter, you're going to walk through gang-riddled communities to go to school on time. And so when we started to think about that, I was like, well, would you walk through the community as a grown adult at 6 o'clock in the morning in the dark to get to school? And if you don't, does that really show off that you don't care? Or is it that you care about your well-being and you're scared? And so forcing them to walk through these communities, it opened us up to kids bringing weapons, because naturally you're going to kick into survival mode and want to make sure you don't die on the way, right? There's so much more to that situation that for the purpose of this conversation is irrelevant, but it just helps us really understand that there are multiple perspectives that have to come to the table to really solve community issues, right? And the importance of the multiple perspectives is that each of us sees it a little bit differently. And so had I not been a person that ended up in conversation with young people about, like, well, why don't you come to school? That may not have been the answer I got, right? If we didn't have the perspective from security that it just takes really long because it's a lot of kids funneling into school and most of them arrive at the same time, right? All of these different mindsets then came together and had a more informed conversation about what might the problem be other than the surface of what we could see. And so when we're thinking about the role of community and we think about social support or shared resources or collective action, that requires multiple voices to be at the table. And that requires us to be able to listen and to talk about what we think could be the solve, the fix, or the problem, and really spend more time attending to deconstructing the problem from the perspective of not only the people who are here to help, i.e. social service support, shared resources, but from the people experiencing the problem. And oftentimes, not in all communities, but in some communities, people who are there to help the community don't listen to the community. And so we don't get the perspective, which is probably most valuable, which are the people who need the most support, right? And so how the well-being of people is intertwined with environmental health, what we all know, and I think COVID really, put a punctuation on that, is that people who live in communities that are already experiencing marginalization because they don't have access to certain resources, there are additional things that they are battling that are connected to environmental health and wellness, right? Whether it's decrepit housing, whether it's poisonous soil, whether it's unclean water, right? So enabling folks who live there to, one, play part in solving the problems, but two, engage in collective action on behalf of themselves also allows them to gain a sense of agency that is very helpful long-term, right? Like when you think about ownership, I know in Newburgh, NACA was here. I don't know if you guys are familiar with NACA, but they basically help people purchase homes as first-time mortgage buyers. And so there's a ton of research that talks about how people care and tend to things that they own, right? That allows me to say, I'm going to invest and stay in this community for 20, 30 years, and I'm not leaving. And so I'm invested in not only, my own personal property, but I'm invested in helping other folks really engage in collective action so that they too can become more invested in this process, right? And so it shouldn't be that clean air and clean water is reserved for those folks who can afford to have clean air and clean water, right? That should be a basic right. And at this point, just to be honest, I don't think any of us have clean water. None of us have clean air. So it's not, indicative to one thing, but I think the things that we're thinking about in terms of sustainable practices for young people and for people who live in communities is such an integral part of our survival, right? But when we think about, well, what is collective action? What does sustainable practices look like for people? When you bring entities together, a school and a community and teachers and resources in the community, and we work together, we think about community gardens, right, that have been created all throughout this world, that really work to center sustainably sourcing food and playing a part in building those things, right? We think about how do we connect our community to school systems that then high schoolers, any age really, but high schoolers particularly, can play part in solving some of the community problems, right? And then we can connect that to science-based instruction, for example. So we can have science teachers work with young people to test the soil that they plant their food in for their community gardens, and they can make sure that soil is appropriate. And if that soil is not appropriate, they then can go to the government, the city government, and advocate for ways to solve that problem. And so really this whole talk is about how do we enable the people in the community to play a larger role in solving the community's problems. And I'm not minimizing the amount of weight that these folks have. What I am calling out is a system that typically says this help is coming and no one's showing up for real. And so the way I've looked at it and thought about it was like, a lot of the problems that have been solved have come from regular people, boots on ground. It doesn't come from the system. When we look at huge movements that have shifted people to live better, to have more productive lives, to have a greater sense of health and a quality of living, that has come from regular individuals figuring out a way to harness the knowledge they have and build something sustainable. And so the reason I'm using the examples of the things in a community, because I think they're very much underutilized. And when we think about how kids even engage in school structures, there are a lot of schools that kids are bored out of their mind because we're not figuring out how to leverage instruction in a way that really allows them to make meaning. And there's no greater meaning to make other than let's look at our community and let's figure out how do we create lessons and support so young people can play a part, right? And that story I just gave you wasn't fictitious. That story was actually from a person who did that in California. And they used those examples for their kids to then go and advocate on behalf of, we have these gardens, our community uses these gardens, we take the food from what's grown and we use it in our food, our meals, and we're realizing that the soil is deadly. And so what can we do on behalf of our community to provide the families who live in the community appropriate supplies and support so that they can continue their gardens, but know that the soil they're using does not have high counts of whatever minerals, leads that they shouldn't, right? And then the government responded with giving out community boxes in terms of soil and resources where they can then still plant, but it was safer. But you solved multiple problems using that one example. And so when we think about its connection to environmental health, what we know for sure is that certain people live shorter lives based on the environments they live in. And that's typically connected to unhealthy, all the things I said, right? So I don't want to belabor it, but there's all these things that we know are directly correlated and an outcome of living in impoverished communities. And so the bigger question is, are we willing to be bold in the way that we think about solving our problems? Are we able to figure out ways to support the people who are in those communities to feel a sense of agency and efficacy and having a voice that's respected and heard, and then utilizing that feedback to create systems that actually are reflective of real needs and real solutions, right? And are we willing to do that in a way that we recognize we have to be mindful of the ask, which is why I'm specifically connecting it to other entities. Kids have to be in schools. So that's a place that happens. We know they go and learn math, science, all these things, which then you can harness that instruction in a way that allows them to come out with solutions that then you bring to the system to say, now, how do we fix this? What do we need to do? And if we're in schools and we're in communities and our goal is to build bridges, every talk I give, no matter what the topic is, anywhere in this world, is always about relationships is the root of solving our problems. And so not only do I get to have a voice, but people get to respect my voice as one aspect of collective action towards fixing something. And so the reason it's important that schools and churches and social service agencies all work collectively and not in conflict is because it's less about who gets the credit for solving the problem. It's more about how many lives do we save when we solve the problem. And oftentimes that gets distilled out, right? Because what often we see are community agencies that are spending more time fighting over who gets to do what, as opposed to say all hands on deck. Like, what do you need me to do? How can I support you in this initiative? What position or role can this organization play in harnessing the change you're trying to harness, right? How do I leverage my staff in a way that contributes to this collective action, right? Coming in with a service disposition, right? I don't have all the answers, but certainly there are some things I know that can be utilized to solve this. And so when we walk in, do we walk in with a learner disposition or a teacher disposition? Because they're wildly different. The goal is for us to realize that sometimes we're the teacher and sometimes we're the student. And we have to be willing to relegate ourselves to that position to say, I'm going to learn today and I'm going to teach tomorrow, or vice versa, right? Being able to understand which disposition is needed in this moment for me to contribute is one of the biggest keys and opportunities that I think sometimes we miss. And it's not because people are mean-spirited or selfish. I think it's because all of us who come to this work come with the awareness of the urgency of which we have to move. And so do not take my comments as an indictment or judgment around our mind's ability to try to problem solve immediately. I think that's what happens when people are good people. We want to move the solution to alleviate the problem. The challenge is if we don't actually understand the problem or really come in willing to be in service of achieving a goal, sometimes our overzealous nature can kind of disrupt how much we can impact it in a positive way. And so we've already kind of, these slides are just here for folks who want to take notes, but we've already chatted about the importance of inclusivity. Like, how do we create shared spaces for people, right? How do we leverage those multiple voices? How do we bring them together? What are the protocols we use when we come together? How does the agenda move from theory to action? Because oftentimes we situate ourselves in theory. We just talk about the problem. I always say we're really good at admiring the problem. Like, we do that so well here. But when do we move to a space of like action, that we actually try to solve this, right? And so thinking about not only creating the shared spaces, but how do we engage in a manner that in that shared space that we all understand our role and what we're bringing to the table. And hopefully what's the goal after, right? And then in there, how do we facilitate communication? Is it one way, two way, three way? Do I just speak to you? Do you get to speak back? Is it a conversation? All of those things are how do we set up conversation and spaces to not only be vehicles to move towards solution, but how do we create the container so that folks come fully formed and are able to really think about, well, what is it that I can provide support? How do I move through this? How do I engage in a way, right? And all of those skills for all of us, I'm assuming most of you work in some sort of community action, all of that. We've all had the disgruntled human who calls, who's mad, who's upset, who feels unheard, right? And typically when those people, when I was a principal, people would call and curse me out. I promise you, it happened a lot. And once the folks got off the mountain, like once they stopped cursing and I really was able to sit with them and listen, what I heard is I need your help. What I heard is I'm extremely frustrated at this process. What I heard is I'm screaming about what I need and no one's listening to me. And because many of us can only hear the scream, the moment people communicate in that way, people dismiss them of not having a real point. And that's usually not the case. But we have to be wired in a way that I realize when you're angry that I didn't actually do anything to you, but certainly I can do something to support you. And that looks like me talking with you and listening long enough that I can find whatever frequency you're tuned in at and then talk to you in that frequency to bring you down in a way where you can come back to just talking with me and you can be upset and you can cry, you could do whatever you need to do. But I want to be in service of supporting you. And so I have to be open and willing to try to hear people's voices in the best way they know how to communicate them, even though it may not be my way. And so the best form of solving problems is to solve that for both the individual, the community, and how it connects to the environment. Like, you can't really solve one without thinking about how it impacts them all. But a few examples, I said community gardens, local sustainability projects, neighborhood support networks, right? The other thing that I think really happens in communities that I haven't been able to really understand deeply, but I understand it from me growing up in the communities that I grew up in, is that there's like an inside track. There are people who know everything that happens in that community. And oftentimes, if we don't really pay attention, we might look at the wrong people and not realizing there are other people who are just the quiet grandma on the steps, or the teacher in the school who happens to be the mayor, right? Like, there are people who have a beat and a jump on what's happening in the community. And so building bridges requires us to really sit with those people and talk with them to really hear how they see themselves in solving the problem, but more importantly, them giving us the information we need to create some sort of collective action care network that really we can go back to kind of get feedback about the things we're implementing, right? Because even if you implement really great programs or initiatives, sometimes we don't have enough feedback loops set in so that we can figure out, is this working? How's it being received by the community? Is it really supporting them in the way that they need? What are some tweaks potentially we need to do to further enhance the support we're giving? You know, all of those things. And that comes from support networks where you can really gather your feedback from, right? And so that it's essential that there's some sort of feedback loops built into any of the action that you're working on, because that will keep telling you if you're going in the right direction. There's nothing worse than walking 3 miles in the wrong direction and realizing the place you're going is behind you, not in front of you. But if you have those markers with the trusted people who can give you honest feedback, right? They're willing to give you critical feedback and you're willing to hear it. It really can inform your process in a way that allows you to move closer together in terms of that relationship building I said before, and further away. And the piece that's super important is that when I'm involved in those networks, do people feel as if they're being heard? And do they believe that they can give you critical feedback, even though you had the best idea ever, but that idea is not working? And can you be open to hearing that maybe it's not working, even though it's well-intentioned, even though you took a lot of time to solve it? There are two things that I think happen often in communities. Either we don't give something long enough time to actually become a sustainable practice, or we keep a practice that we now have evidence that it doesn't work, but people have invested so much time in, we just keep it. And then we blame the people. Like, it's just not working because of them. And sometimes it's like, it's just not working. Like, I don't even care whose fault it is, right? And so what's the middle of that, right? That I leave something there long enough to really create change. And if we have evidence that says this is actually not doing what we wanted it to do, that we're willing to go back and refine the process and think about what tweaks we can make to actually solving that problem. So the ways that we continue to build strong communities, there's one thing I think it's a phenomenal idea. I've seen it done several times now from several different people. And it's called, the way that they frame it is an economic experiment. And the genesis of the economic experiment was, there are people, so I'll tell you where it came from, because it didn't come from me, and then I'll apply it to our community, right? And so there's a person, her name is Pinky Cole, and she owns a vegan restaurant. I won't tell you the name of it because it could be offensive, so you can Google her, it'll come right up. But she's world-renowned, known for her restaurants. And she's also an influencer. And so she went on her social media and said, we have this, it was a Black-owned business that has a great message, has a great product, but that business is about to close because they don't have enough money to pay whatever they needed it for, whether it's the operate the business, overhead costs, whatever. She says, this is what I am proposing. What I'm proposing is that every one of you go to her website and purchase some merch. And long story short, within 7 days, now she is an influencer, but I think she's on to something that we haven't tapped into as a community yet. Within 7 days, they raised $100,000, not in donations. It was $100,000 in product that now this company had to manufacture and send, right? The company's name is Mess in a Bottle, and they do all these different types of stuff. And her name is Pinky Cole. But what it basically showed is that the change that we're looking for can come from the regular person. Because as I said, it wasn't donate money. It was like, go buy a t-shirt, right? Just support the businesses within your community so that they can solve their problem. And it's not through donation. It's just by support and buying something that you like, that you'll wear, that adds to her bottom line so she can sustain herself. And I just thought that was such a fascinating idea. I was like, this is so easy, right? She's done it other times. And every time they raise about 40, 50 grand for that place. But most of her conversation was around just purchase a product in the community. Now, the reason that I'm particularly interested in that is when I think about some communities that have been, that's done very well. Part of the reason the community does well is because the wealth in the community circulates within the community 5 or 6 times before it leaves the community. And so when we think about some of the communities we're living in, there's a ton of businesses that we don't always support because it's easier to use DoorDash or it's easier to go here. Like there are reasons, and we don't have a targeted focus on who are the businesses within the community that need local support. And so we might, I mean, I'm a Fender, number one, right? I'm going to go on Amazon and I get it in 24 hours and it's here. I don't have to think about it. But imagine what happens if I make a very intentional decision to only buy products from my community. Technically, everything you probably need, you can buy within your community. I mean, barring whatever, the big stuff. But the concept is one that I think we can learn and start to ideate around, because this idea of building stronger communities is completely attached to preserving wealth within the community, to letting that dollar continue to circle and circulate through that community before it goes back out into the larger communities. And right now, most often that's not happening. And part of the reason it doesn't happen, it hasn't happened before, but it's specifically not happening now, is because we have large conglomerates that make it really easy for us to get the stuff we need without putting in that much work, right? Now, I'm not solving a problem that I think other people haven't solved. You notice it in certain communities where when a larger company wants to move in, like example, I used to live in Beacon for many, many years. And when I lived in Warwick as well, and when a Walmart wanted to move to Warwick, the community was like, you're not coming here because you're big and you're going to take the money out of our community, right? So there was a very clear local movement, local effort to stop bigger companies from coming in and diluting the dollar. Now, what I'm talking about is probably bigger than this conversation, but I think it's an important solution, again, that reminds us that the collective action that we need to solve our problems can indeed, some of that action can come from us in our communities. But it requires us to really think in innovative ways about what the problem is and what potentially this fix is. And those two things come together when we listen more than we talk. And then when we're able to ideate together in non-judgmental ways and allow all the table conversations to sit on the table, and for us to think about, poke holes and ideate, iterate on each of them to think about, does this apply to said community? The whole reason I didn't come on and talk to you about here are these discrete things you can do, because I think that oversimplifies the problem. And the other piece is, so often we're looking for someone to give us a solution that's not actually real. And so most of the things when we think about solving for communities, you could probably Google them. You don't need me. We don't have to talk. You could Google, there's some books out there that'll tell, oh, do these 5 things and you can fix the community, which we all know, if that was effective, we wouldn't even be having these calls, right? And so it's for us to really engage and reignite that we have the ability to think deeply about how to solve a problem. And more importantly, we have the ability and opportunity to invite others to think in similar ways about what does it look like? What is collective action? How do you do that? And that requires us to get organizations and leaders on board in the same room. And it's beyond the talk of here's what we can do, but more about how do we do it? What does this look like from the vantage point of said organization? What is it that we have to do to build infrastructure so that we can actually do the things, right? And it requires all the traditional things, right? Providing resources, creating programs, and fostering partnerships. So that to me is the obvious answer. But I think there's a larger conversation that we can have. And the reason I bring up those two specific things, one, how do we harness what's happening in schools for young people to play a larger part in creating change? And two, what is the way that we can work collectively to improve and support economic development and empowerment within communities? What does that need to look like? Now, the thing for us to also think about, and I'm going to wrap up so we have some time to chat, is when I watched her do that and say, well, we'll just use this money and this is how we can do this thing, I was like, this is dope. Like, I say that to say, while those are moments I've thought about, like, and I might contribute here or there when I hear of a cause, I haven't seen someone call for community action like that, who people listen to. And so I thought about, I wonder how many people don't think that they're part of the solution because they haven't been empowered to do so. And that's the piece that I think we've missed, is that I don't know, I can't say people don't or do want to support or not, but what I can say is I don't know if everyone knows how. And so there's a push, there should be a push for us to educate folks on the small things we can do in a community. And that's in conjunction with the businesses understanding if the folks in your community are going to be the consumer and really leverage what they do have and what they do have in terms of liquid cash to spend, you as the business owner needs to be equally responsible in not price gouging people, because we have to work cooperatively and this is a relationship. That's what will allow that kind of to come together, which I think is what sometimes gets, lost or forgotten, is that each person, each entity may not know their role. So I'm going to support and shop in my community, and my business owners are going to make sure that they're not price gouging me because they now know I'm shopping in my community. And yes, I can push a button to order on Amazon or take a cab up to Walmart, but I'd rather spend my money here. I understand I'm not going to get Walmart prices, but I know there are moments where people are raising prices because they know it's in the community and it's close proximity. And if there's a food desert, you're going to charge 3 times for that apple that you don't have to charge 3 times. And so there's a collective responsibility that all of us have to engage in to work cooperatively to solve our problems. And that takes greater conversations with everyone about what is the role. As I said earlier, when we come into the room, I need to know my role in this. And so solving a lot of these issues are very much an economic issue, but it requires us to really deeply understand collectively what is my role and how does my role influence and impact the solution for a community. Because if I don't understand why I'm doing what I'm doing, you're just asking me to do it, I may miss the significance of the ask. And so we have to over communicate in a really respectful, gentle, compassionate manner why each person is at the table and what we're asking of them. So there are ways you can measure it. They're the typical metrics, and then the call to action, and we'll stop on this, is build community connections. How do we build our relationships? What does it look like, feel like, and sound like? What is the work you need to do in private so you can show up in a manner that's helpful, collaborative, and cooperative, and not working from a space of ego? I have the answers. I'm here to solve your problem, because that gives off saviorism vibes, and it doesn't feel good for folks who need your help. To join or start a local initiative, support community-focused policies. The policies can be that collective action we talked about, if that's something that a community, depending on the size of it, wants to engage in, or even as a practice. connect with the neighbors. So how do we network with folks? So we really get to hear from the people who are experiencing, know the community, are in it every day. Build sustainable partnerships. So can we figure out a way to create that relationship between business owners and potential patrons and all of those things? And do we engage in collective action to say, what are the ways in which we can harness this entire community, that each of us can just do a little bit towards a collective bigger impact? So I'm going to stop there. I will share my information. I can be reached through email, my website, all the things. But I'm curious, and maybe the opportunity will be for us. There's not a lot of us on the call, so I think we probably can just, I'm going to stop sharing. I think we just probably have a conversation as opposed to a small group. So I went over a little bit, like 3 minutes, but.
Oh, this was absolutely wonderful. I'm just going to stop the recording right now. So thank you on recording.
You're welcome.